you can turn to 1 Timothy chapter 3. We're going to eventually read everything between 3:14 and 5:2 and use this passage as a guide. If you're not familiar with 1 Timothy, we're sitting here in the heart of the book. And at the beginning of chapter 3, Paul gave Timothy the qualifications for elders and then the qualifications for deacons. And then we'll begin our reading right there after that. The end of this section is the beginning of the qualifications for supported widows by the church and supported elders by the church. So sort of we're sitting in between these two conversations about the logistics of how a church runs. You know, these are qualifications for elders. This is if you can support a widow indeed. So we're sitting in between logistics. But here in the middle is when Paul's going to tell Timothy how he needs to conduct himself in the house of God. These are the attitudes and the attributes you have to put on so you can, and what I'm going to argue tonight, so you can influence the church for good. And that's what I want to look at. I want to look at how Timothy is told how he can influence the church for good. And really, Timothy's obviously the preacher at Ephesus. But if we would just look at this as this is what the Holy Spirit wants Christians to know, and if all Christians would try to take on this attitude, this is how you can influence the church for good, we would obviously be so much better off for it. So I'll be looking at these church connections. And at the end of the day, when we read chapter 5, we really are going to hit at this thought that this is what the church is about. The church here is about developing these relationships that I can exhort you for good and you can exhort me for good. And that's what we'll get to by the time we get to chapter 5. So break this apart with me. And once we read it all, we'll come back at the end and make just some heavy application. If you look here in 3:14, we probably have one of the most famous verses from chapter 3, and we'll use it a lot. Sometimes we'll wear this phrase out, how to conduct yourself in the house of God. If you start here reading with me in verse 14, he says, "These things I write to you that I hope to come to you shortly, but if I'm delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of the truth. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed onto the world, received up in glory." They are giving us a summary of the New Testament. Perhaps that's a hymn that the Christians sang there. But we love verse 15. Verse 15, he talks about how, look, if I'm delayed and I can't come to you, well, don't worry, Timothy. You have now a written record of how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar of the truth, right? Now, when we use this passage, usually we want to talk about it, and I hate saying this word, but I'm trying to use it the way we use it. Usually we use this passage to talk about doctrinal issues. Now, I don't like using the word doctrinal issues like that because all of it's God's doctrine. It's not just the logistics versus the relationships. No, it's all the doctrine of God. But we usually use this verse to talk about logistics. This is how you appoint elders. Well, you need to conduct yourself in the house of the living God. Is that true? Would this verse be applicable to that? Of course it is. You can use this verse, and we'll still use this verse to talk about the logistics. But what I'd like to argue as well is that we can also use this verse to talk about how we're supposed to treat each other within the church and how we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves and how we're supposed to esteem and highly esteem one another and show humility to one another. That phrase we'll use for those sort of relationships too. So let's not negate it and say, well, this is only talking about logistics. No, there's a concept of this is what your attitude should be as you conduct yourself in the house of God, which of course is the church of the living God. Let's keep on reading. Look at chapter 4, verse 1 now. And what I want to bring up is this argument that he's making that the Spirit, the Holy Spirit has warned Paul that sooner rather than later, the church will fall into apostasy in general. Now, of course, there'll still be the remnant, but there's going to be many Christians that will fall into apostasy, especially after the death of the apostles. Chapter 4, verse 1. "Now the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. For every creature of God is good, and nothing is to be refused if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by the word of God and prayer. And I'll pause before we read more. The Spirit had warned Paul, and now Paul's warning that to Timothy and to us as well, that eventually, once the apostles are gone, Satan's going to move in. And now that there won't be the apostles there just to blatantly and bluntly enforce the truth, it's going to be up to those that have the word of God to enforce the truth. Because what's going to happen is that people are going to eventually speak lies and hypocrisy, right? And they're going to try to enforce things that shouldn't be enforced, like abstaining preachers from marrying or abstaining certain foods, even though they were given with thanksgiving. And Satan's going to try to make the gospel about something it's not. And instead, the people's conscience is going to continue to live in this and dwell in this for so long. It's going to be hard for the average Christian to see the difference between the lie and the truth of the gospel. So if this is so terrible, what is Timothy supposed to do about it? And that's the negative. When we flip here to verse 6, this is the solution to that. Verse 6, if you instruct the brethren in these things, you will be a good minister of Jesus Christ, nourished in the words of faith and of those good doctrine which you have carefully followed. But reject profane and old wives' fables and exercise yourself towards godliness. For bodily exercise profits a little, but godliness is profitable for all things. Having promised of the life that now is and which is to come, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance. For to this end we both labor and suffer reproach because we trust in the living God, who is the Savior of all men, especially on those who believe. These things command and teach. And notice we ended here, these things command and teach, and we began in verse 6 with, instruct the brethren, right, in these things. Be a good minister of Jesus Christ. So what's the solution to the lies and hypocrisy? The solution is teach the truth, right? Be a good minister of Jesus Christ. And of course, that would be geared towards preachers. But I think we would all be, or you would be comfortable with me saying, this is geared towards everybody. You know, be good ministers of the truth of Jesus Christ. And if we teach these things and we practice in these things and we reject fables and we live in the truth, well, we'll all be better off from it. And we don't have to worry about these lies because we'll know what the truth is. Now, verse 12. If the conduct yourself in the house of God is the most famous part of chapter 3, well, this is the most famous part of chapter 4, which is the famous, let no one despise your youth. You know, something that most of us at first saw on a t-shirt for some kid that we definitely despised their youth by the way they were behaving, right? Look at verse 12. Let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. Till I come, give attention to reading, to exhortation, to doctrine. Do not neglect the gift that is within you, which is given to you by prophecy with the laying on the hands of the eldership. Meditate on these things, give yourselves entirely to them, that your progress may be evident to all. Take heed to yourself and to the doctrine. Continue in them, for in doing so you will save both yourself and those who hear you. And again, the big thing I want to bring out is where we left in the last section. These things teach and command. And then he says, let no one despise your youth, but being examples to the believers in what, number one? In word. The things you teach, the things you say. You know, stave off this prophecy of for the latter days by the Spirit by teaching people the gospel. And then he even goes on to say in verse 13, right? Verse 13. Give attention to reading, to exhortation, to doctrine. You know, give your focus to the scriptures. Read them, learn them, teach them to others. And then what does he end with? If you continue in this doctrine, you will save both yourself and those who hear you. So number one, if we're going to stave off this terrible, wicked prophecy by the Spirit and stave it off at least for us, then we have to be examples to the believers in our speech, in our word. Now let me add the other things Paul adds. Well, it's not just what you say, but it's also in your conduct. And that parallels really nicely with chapter 3, which he says this is how you should conduct yourself in the house of God. So it's not just what I say, but it's also what I do, right? And it's not just those things, it's also in love. That, you know, I should be able to show the love for my brethren in the things that I'm doing. They're more willing to listen to me if they believe that I love them. And God, frankly, is more willing to help me if I truly love him. Also in spirit, that I just don't worship God in truth, but I also worship in spirit. And I think the thought here is sincerity, that you actually believe the things that you teach in faith. That should be obvious. You can't please the Lord unless you have faith, and you're certainly not going to please the house of the Lord unless you have faith. And obviously in purity. And I want to save a discussion about that for what we're about to read in chapter 5. But those things will be attributes on how you can exhort the church for its own good. And what do all these things ultimately do? Well, and I'm going to use the word that we usually use negatively, but it helps us manipulate the church. And the positive word we use instead of manipulate is usually the word influence. Be an example to the believers, right? This is how I'm going to influence the church. This is how I'm going to manipulate the church for its own good and ultimately for my own good too. Well, now let's tie a bow on it, which is 1 Timothy 5:1-2. Maybe this is a bad chapter break. Maybe it's a good one. It's certainly a transitional statement. Verse 1 of chapter 5. Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father. Younger men as brothers. Older women as mothers. Younger women as sisters with all purity. There's purity again. Usually when I end up teaching Timothy, you know what I do, verses 1-2? I just go, yeah, we understand that. Let me tell you about widows indeed. and that's how sometimes we jump, because we really love let no one despise your youth, and we really love talking about widows indeed, and we skip this little transition thought. The rest of the sermon tonight is going to be about those next 2 verses. Because if I'm truly going to conduct myself in the house of God, then I need to have the correct type of relationships with those that live in the house of God. That would make logical sense. And what is the house of God made up of here in chapter 5, 1 and 2? Well, there's 4 quadrants, right? He talks about older men, older women, and younger women. That's what makes up the house of God. And there's a message there of how we should treat the other people that live here with us in the house of God. And that's what I'd like to explore and really hone in on from here on out. The first thing that's said in chapter 5, verse 1 is this line about do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father. And certainly, the focus here is on the older man. That you wouldn't want to rebuke an older man, and I don't think rebuke is used in the way like it's used in other places in the Bible. You know, Leviticus 18 uses the word rebuke as a word of love. I think he's obviously talking here about a harsh rebuke, a very spiteful rebuke. But he says, don't rebuke him like just some older man. No, you instead exhort him as a father. But then what does he continue to say? Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers. So what I want to propose to you is that do not rebuke an older man is not only talking about that older man. It's talking about all 4 of those different types of relationships you can have within the church of the living God. So instead of rebuking an older man, I should do what instead? I should exhort him as a father. And I think that, again, that's included to older women, to younger brothers, and to younger sisters. That I should treat them like they're my family unit. And so I don't harshly, spitefully rebuke them, but instead I try to manipulate them by exhorting them. Well, the next part I was going to say here is, what's the word exhortation mean? We say it all the time when we talk about the Wednesday night talk. Do we even know what it means? And I thought that was going to be something special and new, but Noah got up here on Wednesday night and was like, let me give you a definition for exhortation. And I was like, man, well, there's my thunder right there. But I'm going to try to do it again. What does the word exhort mean? This is Strong's definition of what the word exhort means. And you can see how it's the opposite of this sharp rebuke. The first definition is to call to one side, to call for, to summon. And the concept of summon means I want you to move, right? Exhortation is not just encouragement to stay where you're at. The concept of exhortation is to encourage you to move somewhere, and specifically to move closer to where I'm at. So if Timothy is going to teach the gospel to save himself and those who hear him, what is he telling people to do? He's encouraging them to move closer to where he's at. And that's what exhortation means. The second definition is the same thought: address, to speak you, to call upon. which may be done in the way of exhortation. It's funny when they use the word exhortation to define what the word exhort means. Entreat, comfort, instruct. I really want to use that last two words there. There's part of exhortation that's comforting. It's not a sharp, harsh rebuke, right? It's not this message of you're a loser and you shouldn't be a loser anymore. There's a concept of comfort there that, hey, that doesn't seem like you. You probably wouldn't have done that in a normal circumstance. I was surprised that you did that in the first place. I think you just need to make this little correction. That's the comfort that comes along with exhortation. It's padded, right? Now, does that mean, though, there's not instruction in it? No, there still is instruction and exhortation. Sometimes we make the mistake, and I've made the mistake too. You know, we've been asked to go talk to somebody, or we feel compelled to go talk to somebody about their sin. And we go in there and we slap them on the back and we tell them about how much we love them and how much we appreciate them. And we tell them how much we love that they go to church here and that they're our brother. And we go on and on and on. And then we leave smiling. And then we realize, oh, wait just a second. I never corrected him about what was going on. So you didn't exhort him, right? Nothing changed. You gave him all the padding, but you didn't tell him to move. Well, that's not exhortation either. I don't know what that is. That's appeasement, maybe. Exhortation is comfort with instruction. It's padded, but it is asking someone to move. And to go back to our previous word, sometimes we use the word manipulate, but what is Paul instructing Timothy to do here for the church's own good? He's instructing him to exhort, to create influence. That's what he's asking for him to do. That I need to be able to move you and you need to be able to move me. And that's how we're going to move each other closer to God. If you know in 2 Corinthians, Paul uses the phrase, my sphere of influence. We all don't know that, but now you know that now. And I thought that was a good way to describe Paul explaining that he knows that there are people that he can influence and they can influence him. But there are people out there that I have no influence over and other people have influence over them. And that's what we all have. We all have a sphere of influence. And what's in our sphere of influence, by the way? Well, our sphere of influence has older men, older women, and younger women. That's all there can be. And certainly, I could use this exhortation to influence my brethren for good, for their betterment, so that I may save myself and save those who all hear me. So let me build this a little bit bigger. And then I want to talk about attitudes. And then I want to turn back and I want to come back to influence at the very end. And then the lesson will be yours. And maybe when you get done with this, you'll think, man, Andrew thought way too much into that. But at least now you too will be thinking way too much into it. So we'll be thinking too much into it together. But this has just been floating in my brain all week. And I really think I'm right about this. There's 4 quadrants here, right? But from a logical perspective, really, there are more folks in there than just father figures and younger brother figures. There are more figures in my sphere of influence. And I think you will all agree with me about this. I have people that I consider to be like fathers here. I have people that I consider to be almost sons here. But I also have peers here, right? I have people that in terms of a maturity level are really in the same path that I'm in. And they're sort of walking side by side with me. And I don't consider my peers to be my fathers, do I? I don't think of them that way. But I also don't think of them as younger brothers that have not had the same amount of life experience that I've had. I consider them to just be brothers and sisters. And I try to treat them not as little brothers, but as brothers and sisters. And if that's the case, there's also some of you that I have a relationship with that's not quite a brother, but not quite a father either. You're sort of in the middle. And I think of it this way. Some of you are 30 years older than me. You know, you are like father figures to me. You could be my father, at least in terms of age. And so, you know, I respect you as a father, and here I'm told to treat you like a father. But then as well, there's people here that aren't not quite that, but they're also not quite brothers either. I know that you're 15 years older than me. I know you have more life experience than me, but you're really not quite old enough to be my dad either. And so obviously, who would those type of people be? Well, I think those would be older brothers and older sisters, right? And I sort of have a relationship with them that's like an older brother and an older sister. Well, if that's the case for them, I also can put the reverse here. That there's also people that aren't really my children's age, that I'm not old enough to be a father to them, but certainly they're not really my peers either. And so I also have younger brothers and younger sisters, and I think that relationship's a little bit different too. But regardless, my 4 quadrants are still up here. I've just tried to be a little bit more detailed in what's contained all in that quadrant. And when I think about my relationships with all of you, we do have different associations based on who you are to me. And I think a lot of you would agree with me that you could put yourself here in this me box. And you too have different types of people that have different types of relationships with you. And you're trying to influence them, and they're trying to influence you, hopefully all for the betterment of our salvation. So now that I've got this up on the screen, let me talk about the attitude aspect of this before I go back to the influence side of this. The attitude aspect of this is that, for one, Paul does split this up by gender. And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge. He does not just say older people or older brethren and younger brethren. What does he do? He splits up father and mother. And he does split up younger men and younger women. There's a reason why Paul splits these genders. And maybe that's painfully obvious, but I think we need to live in a world where we actually say that out loud now, right? That there's a reason that he split this in two. And I think it's as simple as this. The things you talk to your fathers about are not the same things you talk to your mothers about. And some of it is as simple as when I call my dad, usually I want to problem solve with him. And we sit there and we problem solve together about whatever's going on. But when I call my mother, sometimes I call my mother to vent. And I don't necessarily need an answer to a problem. I just need someone else to know what's going on. Those are sort of two different relationships, aren't they? Now, are they both important? Yes. Are they both good? Yes. But they are a little different. For us that are women, we would probably be more likely to go talk to an older woman before we go talk to an older man about a specific issue. And for us that are men, we would more likely go talk to an older man than an older woman for a specific issue. And that's good and that's okay. And I think that's how God designed it to be, right? And let me say this as well. And this shouldn't be something that has to be said, but it does have to be said. There's a reason here why he says younger women as sisters with all purity. There's a reason why he says that too. And the reason is because we are opposite genders. And when we are opposite genders, there is an appropriate thing to talk about with each other, and there are non-appropriate things to talk about with each other. And he's writing here to a male, to a younger man, Timothy, and it's not a mistake that he says treat younger women as sisters with all purity. That when we do have these relationships with each other, these friendships, they need to be pure relationships, especially when it's with the opposite gender. That means we have to use common sense. There's some situations where you're going to have friendships with sisters, if you're a man, and there's certain places you don't need to be with them unless they're your wife or your daughter. That's common sense stuff. If you're a young woman, there are situations and places that you don't need to be with a brother, even if y'all are the best of friends. That's common sense. Because if we're truly going to influence each other for the good, what does it have to be in? It has to be in purity, with all purity, right? Common sense relationships. And every once in a while in a blue moon, you will have a brother that is a creep. And the elders end up having to deal with it. You know, the church should not ever be a place where young women are worried about someone bothering them. This should be the safest place, right? But it not always is. So if we would have this concept, just a very baseline, foundational thought, that when we treat each other, we have relationships with all purity, that should be obvious. That should be number one. And that's why Paul expresses that. Now, that's one attitude he brings out in this section. Here's the other one. There's another attitude here about maturity. That there is a difference between a mother and a younger sister, and there's a difference between a father and a younger brother. And so he splits the maturity level as well, too. And trying to think of a way to describe this, I was reminded of a passage we pulled out in Deuteronomy when we studied Deuteronomy in the small auditorium class recently. Moses is prophesying the evil nation that would ultimately destroy Israel. And as he's describing this evil nation, this is one thing he says about them. He says, a nation fierce countenance, which does not respect the elderly, nor show favor to the young. Moses says right there, that's an evil nation. And so, again, it should be obvious, but I think it needs to be said that there's a concept here that you would respect people that have more life experience than you, and you would be in favor or wanting to protect those that are younger than you. That should be the type of relationship we have with these different four quadrants. And instead of showing favor, I'm going to use the word protect. But there's a concept here that this group up here needs respect, and this group down here needs my protection. And that should be my attitude towards them, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to make some bold statement that we should not respect the young and we should not protect the old. I'm not trying to make some bold statement like that. I'm just saying, in general, this is going to be the type of relationship that you would have. Let me give an example of this. Back when we did the Lord's Supper and we had those that assisted on the Lord's Supper table, the men would get up here, right, and we would all stand in a line behind this table right here. And those that are in the center of the table, what are you more likely to do, y'all men that had done this? If you're closer to the center of the table, usually you're going to do the Lord's Supper talk. Or B, you are more likely to be called on to give thanks for the bread or for the cup, right? Growing up at Prattmont, we did it the same way. And there were just four of us, but we would go and we would stand on, the four men would stand behind the table. Now, for us that at Prattmont, and y'all that were younger men when you obeyed the gospel, and you were allowed to do the first thing you did, right, was you assisted on the table. At Prattmont, there was a general rule of thought that I was going to let the older men get in the center of that table. And as a younger man, what was I going to do? I was going to either purposely walk slower so I would be on the end, or I would actually step out of the way and I would let these older brothers get in front of me and sit in the center of the table. Now, is it a doctrinal thing that you must be this old of this age stand in the center of the table when y'all sit on the table? Of course not. This isn't a doctrinal thing at all. But what was it? It was a way to show respect. It was a way to show respect. So if that's what we sort of were doing, and boys were doing that before I was there, and I just continued the tradition, why not? Why not show respect that way? I don't think that's a problem to do something like that. Now, let me explain the show favor part. I remember specifically one day, I was walking up to the table, and I was probably a teenager, and I walked up there and was assisting with my uncle. My uncle and me walk up to the side of the table, and I stand back and let my uncle go closer to the center. You know what my uncle did one day? He grabbed me by the shoulder, and he pushed me to the center. And then he stood on the outside. And being that he told me to do it, I did it. And I stood on the inside, and I'm the one who gave thanks for the cup that morning. What's that? Is that not showing favor? Is that not showing respect? Now, when you show respect to the elderly and you protect the young, what does that end up doing? That builds good, influential relationships. That's the sort of type of thing I think Paul's talking about here. And if we continue to explore this concept, if you turn to Titus chapter 2, I think he spells it out for us. Look at Titus chapter 2. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus. Titus chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. We're going to see our four quadrants here again. Verse 1. But as you speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine, that the older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, in love, in patience. The older women likewise, that they may be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. Likewise, exhort the young men to be sober-minded, in all things showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech which cannot be condemned, that one who has an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. Especially looking at those words like reverent, they are for younger men, and especially looking at things like the older women are supposed to teach the younger women to do these things. What is that? Is that not respect and protect? That's what builds powerful, good relationships within the church of the living God. And if we would have that attitude towards one another, we would be able to influence each other for the better. So now that we've covered those attitudes, let me go back to influence. And I want to just bring up 2 Old Testament passages, and the lesson will be yours, that I think that this was put into real play. Let me first talk about these older brothers and these older sisters. You know, certainly almost like father figures, but maybe not quite there yet in experience level. What I've come to find to be true, and I think many of you will find this to be true as well, that there are sometimes situations when an older brother or an older sister may have a greater influence than fathers and mothers. And I think the reason why is the word sympathy. You know, when a man that's more like a father figure, and he's 30 plus years older than me, and he says, Andrew, this is really what I think you should be doing. You know, I should be able to take that and respect that and work with that. But how much more powerful is it when another man that's maybe 15 years older than me comes to me and says the same exact thing? Well, here's a guy that has more experience than me, but not as much experience as a father-like figure. But he remembers maybe more recently the situation that I have been in because he's only 15 years away from me. He's able to provide experience and sympathy. And I can understand that sympathy a little bit better when I know he was in the same boat 15 years ago. Are older brothers and older sisters powerful? They can be very powerful. And I just want to give kind of a hint of warning. You know, when we aren't necessarily father and mother figures to people, but we are older brother and older sister figures, we need to be very careful about our influence because you might be able to do more influence where a father and mother figure can't. So there's a concept here of unity that we need to help each other. Do I respect my older brothers and my older sisters? Well, I should. They do have more life experience with me. And I think, again, that should be kind of obvious. And I can explore that more with this other one. Just like I have older brothers and older sisters, I also have younger brothers and younger sisters that maybe aren't quite young, very far away from me, but they're just a couple of years behind me in life experience. I might have a greater influence on them too. Do you remember what Asaph says in Psalm 73? This is one of probably the most famous Psalms of Asaph. But Asaph is trying to figure out why bad things happen to good people. And certainly that's a question that we've all had. And as he's trying to come to conclusions, he realizes that his conclusions aren't really there yet. So he decides that it would be best for him to keep his mouth shut about those things until he's for sure about what he believes. Psalm 73:15 says this, "If I had said, I will speak thus, behold, I would be untrue to the generation of your people. When I thought how to understand this, it was too painful for me. Until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I understood their end." And he explains his conclusion. But what Asaph is saying is that when I'm having to wrestle with hard questions, those are not things I'm going to share with my younger brothers and my younger sisters, because I might do more damage than I would do good. So if I'm not going to share it with the younger generation of God's people, who are the people I am going to go to when I need help? I'm going to go to the people older than me, right? I'm going to go to the older brothers and the older sisters that have been doing this a little bit longer and saying, hey, what do you think about this? That's a safer place to go. Well, why is Asaph doing this? It's because Asaph has the mentality of, I need to protect, right? He's in protection mode. And it's good for many of us to be in protection mode. Now, this is what's neat. The reverse is true as well. Sometimes a younger brother or a younger sister can have a greater influence on me than an older brother or an older sister. And I think that happens here in 2 Samuel 21. If you turn to 2 Samuel 21, I just want to read 2 verses. I love this passage. This is David as an old man. And as David is out on the battlefield as an older man, one of Goliath's brothers sees him and thinks it's a good opportunity to kill him, and he almost succeeds. But David is rescued by a younger man. Verse 16 of chapter 21 says, Then Ishbosheth, who was one of the sons of the giant, the weight whose bronze spear was 300 shekels and was bearing a new sword, thought he could kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and struck the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David swore to him, saying, You shall go out no more with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel. The younger men come to David, knowing that he almost died on the battlefield that day, and says, Look, you are no longer going to go out to battle, lest we quench the lamp of Israel. Meaning, lest we lose one of the best things that we've got. Is this a loving exhortation, or is this a harsh rebuke? You know, these young men could have come up to David and said, David, you're a liability. You cannot come out here anymore. We won't allow it. Go home. Or they could have said, you will no longer go out to battle with us, lest we quench the lamp of Israel. Which one has more influence on what David's going to do? It's not the harsh rebuke, it's the exhortation. And these aren't coming from older men. These are obviously coming from younger men. And the younger men were able to influence David. When I first started teaching the high school class, you know, I had guys in there like Colin and Corbin and Riley and Sam. And they were my buddies. If one of those boys told me, yes, sir, when I had asked them something, they were making fun of me, right? I would have thought, oh, something's wrong because they're telling me, yes, sir, and it's some kind of joke. And why? Because there wasn't that many years in between us, right? I was not a father figure. I was an older brother figure and only a few years older brother. So they did not call me yes, sir, no, sir in that high school class. And I didn't expect them to. But, you know, you kind of have these rude awakening moments. And y'all that are 30s and your 40s, y'all realize this, don't you? There comes a moment when you're walking through the church building and you say, hey, did you have a good day to one of these kids? And what do they respond to you with? Yes, sir, I did. And what's even scary is that they mean it. And what's our knee-jerk reaction as 30-year-old, 40-year-olds? Our knee-jerk reaction is say, you don't have to say sir to me. I'm not a sir, that's my father. But the more I keep on thinking about even things like that, and again, saying yes, sir, no, sir, that's not a doctrine, that's a tradition of men, but it's a tradition of men that we've created to show respect. What am I denying these kids if I don't allow them to tell me every once in a while, yes, sir, no, sir? I am denying them to have influence over me. I am denying them, you know, don't show respect to Andrew. That way you can't manipulate him for good. And some of y'all, you know how to play this game of the earth or the game of life on cheat mode. The game of life on cheat mode is called being respectful. Because the more you learn how to be respectful, the more you learn to manipulate your environment, don't you? And even manipulate those that are in authority over you to really kind of get you off of some situations. And it's okay when some of these people younger than you show you respect. Because this gives them the opportunity to influence you like these men could influence David for his own good, right? Now let me put that in reverse. Some of y'all are 15, 20 years older than me. And I have told you before, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And what did you do? You know what you did. You got on to me for showing you respect. It is good for me to give my older brothers and my older sisters respect. Because what's a strong nation? What's a strong church? It's a church that respects its elders and shows favor to its young. That's good. That's not a bad thing. And certainly we can influence each other by showing that respect. And one more quick last thought. There might come a time, Lord willing, where I will no longer be an effective teacher. You know, Lord willing, in 40 years, 30 years, there might be a possibility that my mind is not where it used to be. And there are wonderful teachers that we all have benefited from that got to a point that their mind was not able to teach the way they used to. Just like David wasn't able to go out to battle like he used to. And you know what will be perfectly acceptable in those days? It will be perfectly acceptable for young sisters and young brothers to come and tell me, Andrew, we can't quench the lamp of Israel. We need you to sit. You're going to do more for us by being here than by taking an active role like you used to. Will that be okay? That will be okay, won't it? Because that's a good way for them to show an exhortation and to exhort me as a father instead of rebuking me like somebody they don't know. And certainly, this respect, protect thing, I think is in here. And one more final thing. Maybe who has the greatest influence of all? It might just be your peers. Because your peers are those that you respect and you protect. And certainly, I don't have to give you examples. Peter, Rehoboam, how many biblical examples we have of people that fail or overcame because of peer pressure. Certainly, those people are influential. And certainly, maybe here just something to consider that we can pull from this passage. Just as a quick invitation, and you can put away your Bibles. If there's anyone here that needs to obey the gospel, we want to do that now. But of course, as well, there might be those here that need the prayers of the congregation. And if this is really the church of the living God, and you're part of the family of the living God, what's our number one goal? We want to exhort you to help you overcome what you need to overcome. If there's any way we can spiritually assist, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing?